1945, God's plan. God's plan, still same passage, hasn't changed. Goal, course to restore the old due to the failure of Christianity. True Father, the history of Christianity was a history of the restoration of the realm of the bride. The Allied nations, or the realm of the Christian cultural sphere, stood in the position of bride. Since the Christian cultural sphere opposed me, 4,000 years of history since Jacob's family had to be indemnified within 400 years. As I couldn't live for 400 years, I had to accomplish this indemnity in 40 years. Herein lies the reason that the history of 4,000 years had to be restored through indemnity in 40 years. If I say that, you can find that in the Family Magazine in the January 1995 issue, page 10. And I read again the main part. Since the Christian cultural sphere opposed me, 4,000 years of history since Jacob's family had to be indemnified within 400 years. As I couldn't live for 400 years, I had to accomplish this indemnity in 40 years. The question is, how could True Father indemnify 4,000 years of history in 40 years when it was impossible for him to live for 400 years and pay by himself? I'll answer at the end of this course of 40 years. Central figures. Second and third Adam, and the third Israel. Period of time, 40 years. Satan's plan. Goal, course to expand the communist ideology and to establish Satan's kingdom. Divine principle. Contemporaneous with this, communism was established in Russia. Stalin soon rose to power as the antitype of Christ at the second advent on Satan's side. Since Christ comes with the ideals of the kingdom of heaven on earth, interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values, the satanic side tries to realize these ideals in advance by building an imitation of the kingdom of heaven on earth, led by the satanic counterpart to Christ at the second advent. Page 295, Divine Principle, PDF. And I read again the main part. Since Christ comes with the ideals of the kingdom of heaven on earth, interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values, the satanic side tries to realize these ideals in advance by building an imitation of the kingdom of heaven on earth, led by the satanic counterpart to Christ at the second advent. Conclusion. Satan's foreign plan was to rule the world through communism. Central figure. Satan and communists. In evil's, obviously evil side, right? Period of time, 40 years. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union with its satellite states and the USA with its allies, which began in 1946 after World War II, 1945, and it finished with the dissolution of the Soviet Union between 1985 to 1991 with perestroika and glasnost. The regions of the Cold War involved the breakdown of relations between the Soviet Union versus the USA, United Kingdom, and their allies in the years 1945 to 1949. You can find this in Wikipedia. God's plan. In 1945, the church, the Israeli monastery, Pastor Beckman King, John the Baptist, or the True Archangel, and in 1946, the Inside Belly Church, Pastor Jojo Bean, a female John the Baptist, were prepared to receive True Father, but both failed. And we know the story. God's plan. In 1945, the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund were created, obviously for good purposes. At first, right? Satan's plan. In 1945, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung as chairman of the North Korean branch of the Korean Communist Party. In North Vietnam, the Vietnamese Communist Revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, leader of the Viet Minh, declared independence from French Indochina, and then he became the first president of North Vietnam. God's plan. In 1947, the CIA was founded in the USA as an external protection. In 1947, the division of Israel, God's side, of Israel, God's side, and Palestine, Satan's side. Satan's side. Israel is on God's side because it's a democratic nation and U.S. ally. And Palestine is on Satan's side because it's a radical Islam nation and it is supported by communist countries. God's plan. Elizabeth to marry Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. In my humble opinion, the marriage of these two became God's second plan, and I'll explain why. True Father. Through 2,000 years of Christianity, God made the second advent of the Lord possible. If immediately after World War II, I could have stood on the victorious foundation of Christianity and the United States based on the Christian cultural sphere, would I have undergone hardships? If they had accepted me in those days, then who would have been martyred? If St. James Martyr had been unable to take that position, who would have replaced her? It would have been a British woman. As seen from God's will, it would have been a woman from Great Britain. The British royal family would have made a connection with me. Doesn't that belong to the realm of Christian culture? Britain gave birth to America. There was a symbolic significance to Korean President Syngman Rhee marrying a Western woman. Ultimately, due to the opposition from Christianity, True Matter gained this blessing. Father said that in 1988, October 3rd. You can find that in Cheonsongkyeon too, the original Cheonsongkyeon. And I read again the main part. If they had accepted me in those days, then who would have been martyred? It would have been a British woman. As seen from God's will, it would have been a woman from Great Britain. The British royal family would have made a connection with me. Ultimately, due to the opposition from Christianity, True Matter gained this blessing. In my humble opinion, this British woman that True Father was referring to was Queen Elizabeth II. And England, due to the failure of Christianity, lost the position as a naive nation. However, still on God's side. Yeah. God's plan. In 1948, True Father went to Humnan prison in order to indemnify the failure of Christianity, and the state of Israel declared its independence. True Father. In 1948, Israel became independent. Therefore, some might think it reasonable for the Lord to come back to Israel. Korea also became independent in 1948. However, Korea was liberated from Japanese colonization, in contrast to modern Israel's situation. Conceivably, both countries may have become independent at the same time because the physical Israel inherited something from the spiritual Israel, Korea. The fact that the Jewish people who had been wandering for 2,000 years found their nation shows that all their sins had been forgiven. Therefore, they could return to their original position. The prophecy that Israel would be restored when Jesus' return was fulfilled. Because Jesus' death was indemnified, mankind was able to receive forgiveness and the Lord of the second advent could come. And you can find this in God's will on the word. And I read again the main part. In 1948, Israel became independent. The fact that the Jewish people who had been wandering for 2,000 years found their nation shows that all their sins had been forgiven. The prophecy that Israel would be restored when Jesus' return was fulfilled. Satan's plan. Fourth and fifth plans. 5-year plan. 1945 and to 1955. Stalin in 1945 promised that the Soviet Union would be the leading industrial power by 1960. As I say, this plan is the satanic imitation of the Marshall Plan, and all communist countries resulted in misery. Yeah. Result of communism. Okay, God's plan in 1948, the Marshall Plan, was designed as an economic development capitalist model for West Europe. For 30 years was the highest economic growth in the world. Satan's plan. In 1948, Kim Il-sung was designated to be the first premier of North Korea. God's plan. In 1949, the NATO was created. Satan's plan. In 1949, the Communist Party of China was established with Mao Zedong as the chairman in China. In 1949, the division of the two Germanies, West Germany, God's side, East Germany, Satan's side. God's plan. In 1950, True Father was released from Hunan prison. Then, for 40 days, he was looking for his disciples, and afterwards, the beginning of his ministry. Satan's plan. In 1950, the Marxist critical theory Frankfurt School gained acceptance among the academy in the US and in the United Kingdom. Confrontation between God and Satan, Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and the division of the Koreas. South Korea, obviously, God's side, North Korea, Satan's side. There's a link below. There's a link about the Korean War in the Book of Revelation by Brother John R. Kenney. He's a church brother, and he gave this sermon in August 2016. He dreamed about the interpretation of this revelation. And I recommend you to watch this video because based on his interpretations, I made other interpretations. So I recommend you to watch it. God's plan. In 1951, Winston Churchill was elected as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. God's plan. In 1952, Elizabeth II began her reign, and in 1953, her coronation was celebrated. She's not entirely good because she's currently part of the elite. Actually, no, she's not good actually. But for now, what I can say is that she's like each one of us who has an original and unfolding mind. But later I will speak more on this point. Yes, I'm going to explain it. Satan's plan. In 1953, the Cuban Revolution started and it finished in 1959. The Institute for Social Research, Frankfurt School, was formally re-established in Frankfurt, West Germany. God's plan. In 1954, the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity was founded, and Reverend Wu as its first president. And CARP was founded by True Father and his followers, which it started with the universities Yonsei and Iowa. Howard Self. I don't know who's him. The roots of World CARP can be traced back to the original campus group that Father created on December 31st, 1954 in Seoul. Father himself was the first CARP member. The precursor of CARP was the Songhua Christian Student Association. Later, national CARP organizations appeared in Japan and Korea in the early 1960s. The Morine Day Foundation, however, goes back to June 18, 1984, at the conclusion of a 3-day meeting with national CARP presidents. Reverend Bong Tae-kim of Korea, Dr. Jun Ho-suk of the United States, and Mr. Hirokazu Okta of Japan. Father declared June 18 to be a date of new determination and a new beginning of CARP, a date to be celebrated each year by all CARP members. At that time, he outlined his idea for the first World CARP Convention. World CARP Convention of November from 2 to 8, 1984, Seoul, Korea. And I read again the main part. The roots of World CARP can be traced back to the original campus group that Father created on December 31st, 1954 in Seoul. Father himself was the first CARP member. The precursor of CARP was the Songhua Christian Student Association. True Father, however, because Christianity, True Father quote, right? However, because Christianity failed to accept an attendee, the incidents at Iowa Women's University and Yonsei University occurred. Yonsei and Iowa University represented the best men's and women's school for educating the young generation. If God's plan for these two universities had been accomplished, they could have become the center of all the organizations in this nation. And I read again the main part. If God's plan for these two universities had been accomplished, they could have become the center of all the organizations in this nation. Satan's plan. In 1954, Mao Zedong was the first to hold the office of a state chairman of the People's Republic of China, and the KGB, Soviet Security Agency, was founded in the Soviet Union as the counterpart of the CIA, which is external, but not for protection, but for espionage. and how to infiltrate communist ideology in other countries of the West, especially in the US. There's something interesting in the Republic of China and the unification movement. Every time the unification movement Providence focused more on one place with a leader or change leaders, in China they also change leaders. For example, when Reverend Hyowon-woo was elected the first Unification Church president, Mao Zedong was elected the first chairman of Communist China. When CAR began operating in Japan, focusing on the first Korean missionary in Japan, focusing on the first Korean missionary in Japan, Sang Yi-che, at that time, China also changed its leader. His name was Liu Shoaki, 1959, and in Shoaki, something like that. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. And in 1970, when President Wu died, True Father transferred the province to the U.S. centralized in Cornwall Bohea Park. And China, on the satanic side, also changed its leader, Dong Bi-wu, 1972. With this, we can learn something new. Japan represents the Eve nation on God's side, externally, but the unification movement represents it internally. Now you will wonder, what about True Father, who is the true Adam and dies in 2012, and Kim Il-sung, who was the false Adam and dies in 1994, and was replaced by his son, Kim Jong-il, and then by his grandson, Kim Jong-un, in 2011. Well, this is a topic that one part I will explain within this workshop later, and the other part that is more complex in the next workshop. Satan's plan. In 1955, the Latin American Episcopal Council, CELAM, or CELAM, was created, a major player in the formation of liberation theology, Marxist theology. And this is interesting because it was created the same year that True Father, together with his disciples, started to introduce the divine principle to the students of theology school from Yonsei and Ewha universities. In one hand, Satan proposed the liberation theology. In the other hand, God proposed the divine principle. And in the same year, the Lao People's Revolutionary Party was founded in Laos. Confrontation between God and Satan. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, and the division of Vietnam. South Vietnam, God's side; North Vietnam, Satan's side. Satan's plan in 1956, the MPLA Party, People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, was founded. God's plan in 1957, 30 new churches were established in South Korea. Satan's plan in 1957, the independent Nazarene movement was created in Lebanon. Confrontation between God and Satan. In 1958, the 1958 Lebanon crisis was a civil conflict between the right wing, God's side, and the left wing, Satan's side, in Lebanon. God's plan in 1958, Sang Yi-che was the first missionary in Japan. God's plan in 1959, Yonun Kim was the first missionary in USA. God's plan in 1959, the number of churches increased to 70. In 1960, the number of churches increased to 700. And starting from 1960, there have been annual joint wedding of 3, 36, 72, 124, 430 couples, etc. In 1970, 900 churches with 300,000 members only in South Korea. Satan's plan from 1932 to 1944 and from 1965 to 1989, the communist genocide, 104 million dead. I put this one here to make a comparison of God's way of expansion and Satan's way of expansion. God's way is with true love and sacrifice without forcing anyone to follow him. But Satan's way is once he takes over a country or a people, he kills those who are against or those who doesn't fit with the system. Confrontation between God and Satan. Laotian Civil War, 1959 to 1975. Between the Kingdom of Laos, God's side, against Pathet Lao, Satan's side. Thank you very much. God bless you and see you at the next lecture. Adieu. Bye bye.